Introduction. The Inquisition. Fire, faith, and the fear of dissent. When we think of the Inquisition, we imagine flames. We picture witches bound to stakes, shadowy tribunals in candlelit chambers, and executioners raising their torches before jeering crowds. We speak of it as a relic of the darkest, most ignorant days of history, an evil buried safely in the past. But the truth is more complex and more enduring. The Inquisition was not a brief eruption of cruelty. It was a system, slow, deliberate, and institutional. It stretched not across years, but across centuries. It evolved, it adapted, it cloaked itself in holiness and law, and in doing so, it became something far more dangerous than violence. It became normal. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about faith, about fear, about what happens when power, wrapped in divine purpose, decides it must silence every voice but its own. It begins not with fire, but with a question. Who has the right to speak, and who must burn for it? Tonight, we begin that journey with Bedtime Lectures, where history unfolds slowly, thoughtfully, and always in the quiet just before sleep. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you believe stories like this should be told, gently tap that bell, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Now take a breath and let us begin. Chapter 1. Origins, Heresy and Control in the Early Church. The story of the Inquisition does not begin with torches or tribunals. It begins with doubt, and the fear of it. For from the earliest days of Christianity, even as the faith spread through the crumbling bones of the Roman Empire, it was already defining itself not only by what it believed, but by what it rejected. Heresy is not a natural concept. It is invented, named, and denounced by those who claim to speak for truth. In the early centuries of Christianity, heresy was not merely theological error. It was danger, not only to doctrine, but to unity, to authority, to empire. In the year 316, the Emperor Constantine, newly converted and eager to secure his reign, issued laws against the Donatists, a Christian sect deemed schismatic. Their property was seized, their gatherings outlawed. In 382, under Theodosius I, the Manichaeans were persecuted. Their beliefs were strange to the Orthodox ear, dualistic, mystical, foreign, and so they were labeled heretics, and then eliminated. These were not isolated incidents. They were the birth pangs of a system. The Church, as it grew, was forced to define itself not just by the words of Christ, but by the boundaries of acceptable belief. And boundaries, once drawn, demand enforcement. By the 4th century, Christianity had gone from persecuted to powerful, from martyrs in catacombs to bishops in palaces. And with power came the fear of losing it. New interpretations arose. So did new sects, Gnostics, Arians, Nestorians, each with their own vision of Christ, of salvation, of truth. The Church declared them heresies. The state made them crimes. This was the beginning of an alliance that would shape 1,000 years of history. The sacred hand of the Church and the mailed fist of the state. Together, they would create an architecture of orthodoxy that reached into every corner of life. And at its heart lay a simple idea: truth must be protected from error, even if that means silencing the speaker. By the 12th century, this idea had matured. The papacy had grown powerful, both spiritually and politically. It stood not merely as a religious body, but as a rival to kings. It ruled not by armies, but by threat, by fear, by eternity. At the same time, Europe was changing. Trade was growing. Cities were rising. New ideas were circulating, not always theological, but social, political, mystical. The Church saw not renewal, but rebellion. Heresies once local now spread like wildfire. The Cathars in the south of France, the Waldensians in the Alps. They preached poverty, they criticized wealth, they questioned authority, and they attracted followers. Not only peasants, but nobles. Not only monks, but merchants. The church watched its flocks drift toward these new shepherds, and it responded not with sermons, but with swords. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued the decretal Ad Abolendum, calling for bishops to investigate and suppress heresy. It was not yet the Inquisition, but it was the seed. That seed grew. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX formalized what would become the first permanent papal inquisition. No longer would local bishops be the sole enforcers. Now, special agents, inquisitors, would be appointed, trained, empowered. They were often Dominicans, men of learning, trained in logic, steeped in scripture. They saw themselves not as persecutors, but as healers, treating the disease of heresy with the scalpel of investigation. The word Inquisition comes from the Latin inquisitio, inquiry, a search, an investigation. But this was no neutral process. It was not a question. It was an answer in search of a confession. The Inquisition did not require evidence as we understand it. It required suspicion, a rumor, a whisper, a failure to attend Mass, a friendship with someone already accused. The accused had no right to know their accuser, no right to counsel, no public trial, and yet many confessed. Why wouldn't they? To be accused was to be caught in a net with no exit. Deny it, and you were obstinate. Admit it, and you were guilty. Resist, and you were tortured. Repent, and you might be spared the fire, only to spend your life in chains. This was not about guilt. It was about submission, and it was effective. The early Inquisition, especially in France and northern Italy, became a machinery of fear. People denounced neighbors, servants accused masters, husbands turned in wives, sometimes out of belief, often out of envy, vengeance, or fear. The church claimed it acted out of love, that heresy was a spiritual disease, and that correction, no matter how brutal, was an act of mercy. Better to suffer in this life than burn in the next. But behind this theology was something older and darker, the need for control. The Inquisition was not an outburst of chaos. It was order, sharpened to a point. In the next chapter, we will trace the expansion of this order, how the Inquisition became institution, how faith became law, and how law, once unmoored from mercy, becomes something else entirely. Chapter 2. Inquisition as Institution, from Barbarossa to Gregory IX. The Inquisition did not burst forth in fire. It assembled itself in silence. Piece by piece, law by law, it grew not from chaos, but from structure. In the 12th century, the balance of power in Europe was shifting. Kingdoms jostled for dominance, cities expanded, and the Roman Church, newly assertive, began to act not just as spiritual authority, but as a state unto itself. One figure looms over this transformation, Emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa. Fierce, charismatic, and shrewd, he understood that unity, political or spiritual, required enforcement. Heresy to him was not merely a sin, it was treason, disorder, a challenge to the very scaffolding of imperial control. In alliance with Pope Alexander III, and later under Pope Lucius III, Frederick lent imperial weight to ecclesiastical ambition. In 1184, the bull Ad Abolendum called for coordinated persecution of heresy, and local bishops were tasked with rooting out dissent. But bishops were often conflicted, too lenient, too busy, or too connected to local nobility. The church needed something stronger, a dedicated force. This need intensified in the early 13th century. Heretical movements were no longer whispers in back rooms. They were vibrant, organized, and persuasive. The Cathars in Languedoc preached dualism and asceticism, rejecting the wealth and corruption of the church. They attracted peasants and princes alike. Their theology was complex, their society disciplined. To Rome, they were an existential threat. The papacy, under Pope Innocent III, responded with crusade. The Albigensian Crusade of 1209 turned southern France into a battleground. Cities were razed, populations slaughtered, entire towns were burned to the ground, not just fighters, but children, women, priests. The famous command of Papal Legate Arnaud Amalric echoed across time: kill them all, God will know his own. But war alone could not erase ideas. Armies might crush a village, but thoughts take root in ashes. And so the Inquisition was born. Under Pope Gregory IX, the Church created a centralized institution in 1231, the Inquisitio Hereticae Pravitatis, the Inquisition into heretical depravity. It was not a mob, it was a bureau. It had rules, procedures, offices. It reported to Rome. Its agents were not soldiers, they were monks, mostly Dominicans and Franciscans, orders formed to preach and convert, but now armed with legal powers to interrogate, detain, and condemn. They were chosen for their education, their discipline, and their obedience. Inquisitors were trained in theology and logic. They were not wild-eyed fanatics. They were calm, methodical, unyielding. Their mission was to investigate, to reveal, to purify, and to do so, they built a system. First came the Edict of Grace, a public declaration offering a window of confession. Those who admitted their heresies and named others might receive leniency. Might. The moment the edict was read in a town, fear became currency. Friends turned, families fractured. If no confession came, inquiries began. Secret ones. A knock at night. A summons. A whisper that became a record. Suspects were interrogated, first gently, then not. Torture was authorized early in the institution's history, particularly after the papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, which sanctioned its use in certain cases. The reasoning was simple. Truth was sacred. Pain was regrettable, but necessary. A soul's salvation was worth the flesh. Confessions were extracted, sometimes through pain, sometimes through despair. Once obtained, they could not be recanted. Sentences varied. Some were symbolic, wearing a yellow cross, public penance, pilgrimage. Others were final, excommunication, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and in the gravest cases, execution. But the Inquisition itself rarely performed the final act. The Church, in its moral calculus, handed the condemned to secular authorities for punishment. "We do not kill," they said, "we deliver." It was a fiction, but a useful one. Across France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, the institution spread. Regional tribunals were established. Local nobles cooperated or were coerced. Inquisitors gained reputations as both saints and tyrants. Some were feared, others were admired. All were obeyed. What made the Inquisition so powerful was not its violence, it was its procedure. It functioned like law. It had precedent, process, records, and that gave it legitimacy. To challenge an inquisitor was to challenge Rome. To speak against it was to declare oneself a suspect. Dissent became dangerous not because of belief, but because belief was now criminal. The Church did not claim it was destroying its enemies. It claimed it was saving its children. Heresy was spiritual disease. The Inquisition was the cure. But the cure, as it spread, began to reshape the soul of Europe. Communities turned inward. Trust decayed. Faith became surveillance. In the next chapter, we will enter the heart of this machine to see how the Inquisition operated from within, the anatomy of a trial, the rituals of interrogation, and the terrifying efficiency of belief enforced by law. Chapter 3: Torture and Trial, Anatomy of an Inquisitorial Process. It began with a whisper, Perhaps a servant noticed something strange. A missing crucifix, a skipped mass, a muttered phrase that didn't align with dogma. Perhaps a neighbor, jealous or frightened, made a quiet accusation. Or perhaps nothing was said at all, only a suspicion in the mind of a priest, a glance in the wrong direction, a name that surfaced too many times. In the world of the Inquisition, silence was no protection, nor was innocence. The process began long before the accused even knew they were being watched. The machinery of persecution turned slowly, but it turned without mercy. Once suspicion took root, the first step was surveillance. Notes were taken, names compiled, witnesses gathered. If a case was deemed viable, if the whisper seemed loud enough, the summons came. And with it, fear. The accused would be brought to the tribunal, not as a defendant with rights, but as a soul in peril, accused of heresy. The charge was vague, the evidence unknown, the accuser anonymous. You were told not who accused you, but only what you were accused of. There was no jury, no open trial. The court was God's, and the inquisitor its voice. First came interrogation, questions asked in quiet, calculated tones, designed not to uncover truth, but to lead toward confession. Denial was expected, and met with more questions, more pressure, more hours. In isolation, the mind wavered, the will weakened. If the answers did not please the court, the next stage followed: torture. It was sanctioned, refined, and ritualized, not as punishment, but as purification. Pain was a tool to break through lies, to reveal hidden sin, to save the soul. One method was the strappado. The accused was hoisted into the air by ropes tied to their wrists, then dropped, suddenly, brutally, dislocating joints, tearing muscles. Another was the rack, limbs stretched slowly apart until tendons snapped. In the Spanish territories, the boot was common, a device that crushed the leg, bone by bone, with wooden wedges or screws. Screams were expected. Confessions followed. Then there was the tortura del agua, water torture. A cloth forced into the throat, water poured endlessly until the lungs burned, the stomach swelled, and the body convulsed in terror. Drowning without death, dying without escape. All of it was documented, carefully, as though sanctified by paperwork. If the accused confessed, their words were transcribed. They were asked to name others. Heresy was rarely solitary. A confession meant not only the end of one trial, but the beginning of many. Punishments varied. Some were public humiliations, forced pilgrimages, floggings, the wearing of the San Benito, a garment of shame marked with symbols of sin. Others were prison, confiscation of property, banishment, and then there was the fire. Auto da fe, an act of faith. The name suggested solemnity, redemption, but in practice, it was theater, a stage for fear. On the appointed day, crowds gathered, banners waved, nobles and peasants stood side by side. The accused were paraded through the streets, heads bowed, garments painted with devils and flames, their crimes proclaimed by clerics. A sermon was preached, a prayer offered. Then the condemned were led to the pyres. Some were strangled first, an act of mercy. Others were burned alive. The fire roared. The crowd watched. Some wept. Some cheered. It was meant to be a warning. And it worked. Across Spain, France, Italy, and beyond, the Inquisition embedded itself into the rhythms of life. People feared each other. They feared themselves. To doubt, to wonder, to speak unwisely was to risk everything. And yet many believed it was necessary, that heresy was poison, that the soul was worth more than the body, that pain could lead to salvation. This was the power of the Inquisition, not just to punish, but to persuade, to make obedience feel like virtue, and silence like safety. In the next chapter, we will follow this system as it spreads into France and Italy where the flames burned high and the machinery of control found new, eager hands. Chapter 4. France and Italy. The politics of burning. The Inquisition, once born, needed hands to wield it. And in the cities and countrysides of medieval Europe, those hands often belonged to the Dominicans. They were called the Dogs of God, the Dominicanes. Founded to preach and convert, the Dominican order quickly became the sharpest instrument of the papacy. Disciplined, educated, loyal, and unflinching, they made ideal inquisitors. Their black and white habits became symbols of fear as they spread from monastery to court, carrying with them the authority to investigate, to judge, and to condemn. France and Italy became their proving grounds. In the south of France, the memory of the Albigensian Crusade still lingered. The land had been soaked in blood during the war against the Cathars, a heresy that had taken root among nobles and commoners alike. Though armies had destroyed cities, the ideas lived on. And where the sword had failed, the Inquisition would now succeed. The Dominicans were sent to root out remaining heresy. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought in silence and suspicion. Heretics were not rebels in the field, but neighbors in the pew. Whispered prayers, secret meetings, books passed hand to hand. The Inquisition dug deep. Courts were set up, records were kept. Interrogations became routine, and the punishments grew. The political class took notice. In France, kings saw an opportunity. The Inquisition could do what armies could not. It could eliminate opposition under the banner of piety. When Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, which legalized the use of torture against heretics, it was not just a theological decision, it was a political weapon. In the hands of monarchs, the Inquisition was no longer merely a church matter. It became a tool of statecraft. Southern France, wealthy, independent, and culturally distinct, was targeted. Heresy was the excuse. Annexation was the goal. The French crown and the papacy moved in tandem, burning heretics and breaking barons. Cities once proud and autonomous were brought to heel. The south was absorbed into the orbit of Paris. The church purified, the crown enriched. In Italy, the story was no less brutal. The peninsula, fragmented into city-states and papal territories, was a patchwork of loyalties and ambitions. Heresy here became a convenient accusation. Dominicans patrolled cities like Bologna, Florence, and Venice. They recruited informants. They built prisons. They conducted autos da fe. The people, for a time, supported them. It is one of the cruelest truths of the Inquisition. It was not imposed by force alone. It was invited. The masses, terrified of damnation and awed by spectacle, often embraced the rituals of punishment. Crowds gathered to see the condemned. Children were taught to fear deviation. Neighbors turned in neighbors. Superstition mingled with policy. A woman with herbs became a witch. A philosopher became a threat. A disagreement became a crime. And the Inquisition, cloaked in religious authority, delivered judgment. The church claimed sanctity. The state claimed sovereignty. And between them, the people were caught. Inquisitors were given broad powers. They operated with papal approval and local support. Property of the condemned was often confiscated, enriching both church and crown. Trials rarely ended in acquittal. Fear was both method and result. And yet, these horrors were not committed in darkness. They were held in daylight, in markets, on stages. The spectacle was the point. Because the Inquisition was not just about punishing dissent, it was about displaying power. It was about warning the future by burning the present. By the close of the 13th century, France and Italy had become laboratories of suppression. The mechanisms were in place. The theology was settled. The crowd, mostly, was compliant. The fire, once lit, would not easily go out. In the next chapter, we journey to Spain, where the Inquisition would evolve further. There, under Torquemada and the Catholic monarchs, it would become something even more terrifying. Not just a tool of the church, but the engine of an empire. Chapter 5. Spain and Torquemada. Faith as Fire. If the Inquisition began as a flame, then in Spain it became a furnace. Nowhere else did the machinery of heresy hunting become so vast, so systematic, and so enduring. And no figure embodies this transformation more fully than Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, a man who took the whisper of fear and turned it into a national voice. The Spanish Inquisition did not rise in isolation. It emerged at a moment of great transition. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon had unified through the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand. Their reign marked the end of the centuries-long Reconquista, the slow, bloody expulsion of Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, Granada fell. Spain was whole. But unity, once achieved, demanded a new kind of war. The enemy now was not outside the kingdom, but within it. Converts, conversos, Moriscos, Jews and Muslims who had accepted baptism but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. In public, they were Christians. In private, perhaps not. That doubt was enough. Torquemada understood this. Born into a family of converso background himself, he rose through the Dominican order with reputation for rigor and orthodoxy. By the time he became confessor to Queen Isabella, his path was set. He believed in purity, not only of faith, but of blood. In 1478, with papal approval, the Spanish monarchs established a new Inquisition, distinct from its medieval predecessors. It was a royal project, not just a church one. For the first time, the Inquisition answered not only to Rome, but to the crown. This was crucial, because what followed was not just a campaign for faith. It was a system of social control, racial hierarchy, and state consolidation. Torquemada was appointed Grand Inquisitor in 1483. He built the Spanish Inquisition into a national institution. Tribunals were established across the land. A network of informants was cultivated. Edicts of grace gave way to mandatory confession. Accusations became indictments, and punishment became policy. Torture was codified, confessions extracted, property seized. Whole families were investigated, generations tainted by rumor. Fear became ambient. The auto da fe reached new heights of spectacle. Processions of the accused marched through cities in San Benitos, robes marked with flames and devils. Crowds gathered, sermons boomed, pyres were lit. Some victims were garroted first, strangled before burning. Others were burned alive. Their screams rang out in plazas named for saints. And the people watched. Many supported the spectacle. After all, the Inquisition promised order. It targeted the suspicious, the different, the formerly powerful. Jews who had risen in wealth and influence were brought low. Moriscos who still spoke Arabic or practiced old rites were punished. And the rewards flowed upward. Confiscated property filled royal treasuries. Enemies were eliminated without civil war. The monarchs, appearing holy, ruled unopposed. Faith and power marched together. But it was not only religious dissent that was punished. It was difference itself. A new concept emerged, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Those with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, no matter how devout, were marked. Excluded from universities, guilds, priesthoods, identity became biology. Heresy became heritage. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, the Edict of Expulsion was issued. All unconverted Jews were ordered to leave Spain. Some converted, others fled, many died. Synagogues were shuttered, communities destroyed. Torquemada reportedly threw the first torch into the bonfire of their books. He died in 1498, but his system lived on. The Spanish Inquisition would continue for centuries. It would reach into the Americas, follow conquistadors across oceans. It would be used to suppress Protestants, silence scientists, and control every layer of society. Even in its decline, its echo remained. Spain became synonymous with religious severity, its name blackened in the eyes of Protestant Europe. Tales of torture, real and exaggerated, filled pamphlets and sermons. The Black Legend was born, a record of cruelty that would shape European memory for generations. And yet within Spain, the Inquisition remained a pillar. It kept the peace. It defended orthodoxy. It promised eternal salvation at the cost of temporal suffering. Chapter 6. The Colonial Inquisition, New Worlds, Old Flames. When Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than soldiers and sails. They carried fire. The conquest of the Americas was not only an act of empire, it was an act of faith. Behind the steel of the conquistadors marched the robes of the clergy, and among them came the Inquisition, reforged for a new world, ready to burn heresy from lands it had only just discovered. The Americas were vast, complex, and filled with civilizations far older than their European conquerors imagined. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, all had intricate religions, temples, rituals, gods. But to the men from Spain, these were not cultures. They were abominations, idolatry, paganism, devil worship. The indigenous peoples were deemed not merely foreign, but fallen. They had to be saved, converted. And when they resisted or hesitated, the Inquisition stepped forward. At first, the mission was evangelization. Priests built churches beside ruined temples. Crosses replaced idols. Baptisms were held in rivers where sacrifices had once flowed. Native gods were renamed as demons. Their festivals were banned. Their rituals outlawed. Some adapted, many did not. The indigenous resistance was often spiritual. Some communities practiced their old faiths in secret, blending them with Catholic forms. Others clung openly to the gods of rain and corn, sun and jaguar. And this, to the Inquisition, was heresy. In the 16th century, inquisitorial tribunals were formally established in Mexico and Peru. Though technically under the authority of the Spanish crown, they mirrored the courts of Seville and Madrid. Accusations came, trials were held, tortures were authorized, confessions followed, punishments were handed down. One of the most feared crimes was crypto-paganism, the secret continuation of indigenous religion under the mask of Catholicism. A family might light candles not to Mary, but to a mountain god. A healer might invoke a spirit not found in the catechism. A child might whisper a name not found in scripture. It was enough. In Yucatan, entire villages were accused of backsliding into Maya ritual. In Peru, the cult of Inti, the sun god, persisted among peasants. And in central Mexico, the memory of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wind and wisdom, refused to fade. The Inquisition responded with fury. Temples were torn down again, this time not by soldiers, but by theologians. Sacred bundles were burned. Priests of the old ways were captured, tortured, made to confess. Their words were written in Latin, their cries transcribed by scribes who did not understand their language. Some were sentenced to public penance, others were hanged, many were burned. Not in hidden valleys, but in city squares before crowds of colonists and converts. The auto da fe came to the Americas. Not as often as in Spain, records show fewer burnings, but enough to cast a shadow, enough to terrify, enough to silence. And yet, the fire could not erase everything. Indigenous spirituality proved resilient. It bent, blended, and re-emerged in new forms. Catholic saints were given indigenous traits. Christian rituals took on native symbolism. Behind the church doors, old prayers lingered. But the Inquisition did not stop with indigenous peoples. It turned next to others, African slaves practicing ancestral religions. Jews who had fled Iberia and crossed the ocean to escape persecution. only to find it waiting in the New World. Portuguese merchants, Protestant sailors, philosophers, poets. The same machinery was deployed, the same questions asked, the same flames lit. Faith, exported, became empire. And yet, even here, far from Rome, far from Madrid, the contradictions multiplied. Priests who opposed cruelty were silenced. Nuns who defended native practices were accused. The colonizers preached salvation and practiced subjugation. Inquisition in the colonies was not just about heresy, it was about hierarchy, about power, about forcing one world to kneel before another. But it failed to destroy the soul. In the songs of the Andes, in the weavings of Oaxaca, in the festivals of the Caribbean, echoes remain. Beneath the robes and the rituals, the old gods smile. Chapter 7. The Reformation and the Counterstrike. By the dawn of the 16th century, the flames of the Inquisition had already burned for centuries. But now, a new fire was coming, a fire the Church did not light and could not control. It began in 1517 with a hammer and a door. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to the church in Wittenberg, cracked the foundation of Catholic Europe. His protest was not merely theological, it was revolutionary. It challenged the Church's authority, its wealth, its indulgences, its monopoly on salvation. The Reformation spread fast, through Germany into Scandinavia, across Switzerland and France. It spoke to a rising class of thinkers, printers, and believers who were no longer content to obey in silence. It offered scripture in their own language, salvation without priestly intercession, a new vision of Christianity built on personal faith. To the Catholic Church, it was heresy reborn, and the response was swift. The Counter-Reformation rose like a wall of stone. New orders like the Jesuits were founded. Doctrine was sharpened at the Council of Trent, and the Inquisition was reignited with new purpose. Now it would no longer chase whispers in the dark. It would battle books, universities, and kings. In Spain, Protestant ideas were slow to arrive, but when they did, they ignited terror. In 1559, in the city of Seville, the Inquisition launched one of its most brutal campaigns against Protestants. A secret community of reformers had taken root, small, scattered, but devout. Among them was a figure known as Julian the Little, a merchant and lay preacher who smuggled Protestant texts into Spain, hidden in wine casks and crates of cloth. He preached in homes, he passed out tracts, he gathered followers. But one mistake unraveled it all. A woman said to be possessed by demons came to Julian for help. He prayed, he beat her with cords, he exorcised her as best he could, but the ritual went wrong. She reported him to the Inquisition. Julian fled, but many of his followers did not. More than 200 were arrested, dozens tortured, confessions spilled. In one of the largest autos de fe in Spanish history, over 100 men and women were paraded through the streets of Seville. Some recanted, some remained defiant. Those who would not bow were burned. In France, the Reformation moved faster, and so did the backlash. The Huguenots, French Protestants, gained traction among intellectuals and nobles. Their movement was met not with dialogue, but with massacre. In 1572, on the night of St. Bartholomew, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris. The killing spread to the provinces. For weeks, rivers ran red. It was not officially the work of the Inquisition, but the spirit of inquisitorial vengeance lived in every blade and torch. The Catholic monarchy, allied with Rome, had chosen suppression over reform. The result was civil war. France burned. Elsewhere, the Inquisition faced resistance. In the Holy Roman Empire, fractured, feudal, and chaotic, the inquisitors found themselves hemmed in by local lords and rebellious cities. In places like Mainz and Nuremberg, towns refused to cooperate. When inquisitors pushed too far, riots followed. Inquisitors were driven out. Their courts shuddered. The German territories, unlike Spain or Italy, were not centralized. Their fragmentation became protection. Protestants built strongholds. The printing press, born in Mainz, became a weapon of doctrine. Luther's words traveled faster than Rome's decrees. And yet the Inquisition adapted. In some regions, it retreated. In others, it went underground. In still others, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, it flared, only to falter again. The battlefield of belief had expanded, and the Inquisition could no longer keep pace. Still, it tried. Books were banned. Ideas were censored. The index of forbidden books grew longer with every decade. From Erasmus to Galileo, voices of reform and reason were added to the list. Some were silenced, others endured. But the world was changing. Faith was no longer uniform. Doubt no longer whispered. It shouted. Heresy had become a movement, a nation, a war. Chapter 8. Women, Witches, and the Malleus Maleficarum. The Inquisition was built to guard faith, but in time, it turned its gaze to flesh. By the late 15th century, the lines between heresy and witchcraft began to blur. The Church, once preoccupied with theology, now saw enemies in those who whispered to plants, who healed with roots, who dreamt beneath the moon. These were not men with books or swords. These were women with herbs, with secrets, with power that could not be easily measured or controlled. And so the fire turned toward them. In 1487, a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer published a book. It would become one of the most infamous texts in history, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Part manual, part manifesto, the book was a declaration of war against women. It argued that women were more susceptible to demonic influence, that they were driven by carnal lust, emotional instability, and intellectual weakness, that their very nature made them fertile ground for Satan's work. It described in detail how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to torture them, how to kill them. And Europe listened. The Malleus spread rapidly, endorsed by clerics and princes alike. Its influence infected courts and councils. It shaped policy and punishment. It gave theological weight to suspicion and license to cruelty. What followed was not justice, it was hysteria. In towns across Germany, France, Italy, and the Low Countries, women were dragged from homes and cellars, accused of flying, of consorting with demons, of killing crops and children with spells and glances. The trials were grotesque. Often begun by rumor, they spiraled into paranoia. Midwives were accused of harming newborns, widows of poisoning wells, healers of invoking ancient spirits. The burden of proof was non-existent. The testimony of a child, a jealous neighbor, or a bitter priest was enough. And the punishments were swift. The accused were stripped, shaved, examined for witches' marks, tortured until they confessed, forced to name others, broken in body and mind, then burned, sometimes hanged, sometimes drowned, always erased. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic. Some regions saw hundreds of executions in a single decade. Entire communities participated. The Inquisition supplied the structure. The people supplied the fuel. It was a ritual of fear. The Church claimed it was purifying Christendom, that the soul of Europe depended on the extermination of this hidden plague. That evil wore the face of a woman. But what truly lay beneath was older than doctrine, a fear of the untamed, of the female body, of knowledge not sanctioned by Rome. Midwives held power over life and death. Herbalists cured where priests failed. Women outside the home or beyond obedience posed a threat too intimate to ignore, so they were made into monsters. Witches became metaphors for disorder, for temptation, for rebellion. The Malleus told men what they already feared, that the world was fragile, and that women could break it. The Inquisition gave them the tools to stop it. And yet not all clerics agreed. Some resisted, some preached mercy, but they were drowned in the roar of public panic and institutional approval. Once a fire is lit, reason cannot douse it. By the 17th century, the witch craze began to decline. Science, skepticism, and shifting politics eroded its foundation. But the scars remained. Tens of thousands of women had been executed. Hundreds of thousands more had been threatened, interrogated, branded. The Inquisition had found a new form of heresy, not in belief, but in being. In the next chapter, we return to the world of men, but not to freedom. We turn to the thinkers, scientists, and dreamers who dared to question the cosmos itself and found the Inquisition waiting for them in the stars. Chapter 9. Renaissance, Science, and the Last Fires. The Inquisition was built to crush dissent. But what happens when dissent comes not from witches or heretics, but from poets, scientists, and dreamers? The Renaissance brought a new light to Europe. It was not just a cultural rebirth, but a seismic shift in the human imagination. Art, science, philosophy, and inquiry bloomed from the ruins of medieval silence. Men and women began to look not only to Scripture, but to the stars. They questioned not only the Church, but the shape of the cosmos itself. For an institution built on certainty, the Renaissance was a threat. It began quietly, with books, with ideas, with paintings that depicted the divine as human and the human as divine, with anatomists cutting open bodies to learn what God had made, with astronomers mapping the heavens, not to read omens but to understand laws. And the Church, particularly the Inquisition, watched with growing suspicion. Dante Alighieri, the great Florentine poet, was among the first to feel the burn of this tension. Though not condemned during his lifetime, his Divine Comedy placed popes in hell, mocked ecclesiastical corruption, and imagined a moral universe outside church law. In 1302, he was exiled from Florence. Later, the Inquisition posthumously pursued his memory. Some records suggest he was tried in absentia. Others say he was condemned to death. He died in exile, his voice echoing long after the tribunals passed. Then came Giordano Bruno. A Dominican friar turned philosopher, Bruno dared to suggest that the universe was infinite, that stars were suns, that Earth was not the center of creation, and that God could be found in the boundlessness of nature. To the Inquisition, this was not philosophy, it was blasphemy. Arrested in 1593, Bruno spent 7 years in Roman dungeons. He refused to recant. He was defiant to the end. In 1600, he was led to the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. A mask of iron covered his face, his tongue was nailed down, and he was burned alive. Not for magic, not for rebellion, but for imagining too much. He became a symbol not just of martyrdom, but of the price of wonder. And then came Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science, a man who peered through a telescope and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving not all things revolved around Earth. A man who wrote, taught, and dared to suggest that Copernicus was right. The Earth moved. The Inquisition summoned him in 1616, warned him, ordered silence. He disobeyed. In 1632, he published dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. The Church responded. In 1633, he was tried, forced to recant. He did. Legend says he whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he did or not, the myth endured. He lived under house arrest until his death, blind, but never silenced. The Inquisition by then was fading, not in name, but in force. The world had changed. Empires rose and fell, nations broke from Rome. The Enlightenment loomed, science surged, philosophy flourished, and the fires of dogma, though still burning, were dimmed by the dawn of knowledge. But even in decline, the Inquisition adapted. It turned to books. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned works, grew longer with every year. Thinkers from across Europe found their names added: Descartes, Rousseau, Spinoza, Montesquieu. The Church no longer burned their bodies, it tried to burn their words. Yet the Inquisition survived into the modern era. In Spain, it lasted into the 19th century. The last execution by burning occurred in 1826. In Rome, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the successor of the Holy Office, still exists today. Its tools are quieter, but the impulse remains: to preserve, to protect, to control. In the next chapter, we will explore the final convulsions of the Inquisition, its last flickers, its political resurrection under monarchs like Franco, and the slow transformation of fear into memory. Chapter 10: Decline and Remnants, Inquisition in the Modern World. By the 18th century, the Inquisition no longer commanded the fear it once did. The world had changed, and with it, the tools of control. Enlightenment philosophers challenged dogma with reason. Revolutions shattered monarchies. Empires bled into republics. And the Church, once supreme, found itself on the defensive. But the Inquisition did not disappear. It adapted. In 1738, the Vatican named a new enemy: the Freemasons. Secretive, intellectual, and often anti-clerical, the Masonic lodges represented a challenge to church authority, not through open heresy, but through independence. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued the first papal bull condemning the Freemasons. It would not be the last. Though not subjected to torture or pyres, Masons became targets of ecclesiastical suspicion. In predominantly Catholic countries like Italy, Spain, and Austria, inquisitorial offices tracked their movements, banned their writings, and excommunicated their members. But the Church was fighting a losing war. Ideas, once chained, were now free. Then came Napoleon. The French Revolution had already decapitated the old order. It closed monasteries, seized church lands, and proclaimed liberty of conscience. When Napoleon rose, he continued the dismantling of ecclesiastical power across Europe. In 1808, he marched into Spain and abolished the Spanish Inquisition. But it did not stay dead. After Napoleon's fall, the old regime clawed its way back. In 1814, King Ferdinand VII restored the Inquisition in Spain, determined to purify the kingdom once more. But the restoration was hollow. Europe had moved on. The Enlightenment had taken root. The fire no longer found fuel. In 1826, in the city of Valencia, the last execution under the Spanish Inquisition took place. A schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was hanged, officially for heresy, though his real crime was teaching deist philosophy. He was not burned. The age of flame was over. But the message remained: the Inquisition could still reach, not for long. In 1834, under the regency of Queen Maria Cristina, the Spanish Inquisition was abolished once and for all. Its buildings were emptied, its records sealed, its name finally buried. But the mechanisms lived on. In Rome, the Congregation of the Holy Office continued its work. It policed theology, it censored ideas, and most visibly, it maintained the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. First compiled in 1559, the index had grown into a vast catalog of condemned texts. It included the works of Copernicus, Galileo, Voltaire, Rousseau, Darwin, even novels, even poetry. The index was not just about heresy, it was about control. The Church no longer burned authors, it silenced them by erasing their words. But even the index could not hold back the tide. By the mid-20th century, the world was reading what it pleased. Science had reached the moon. Philosophy had left the heavens. And the Vatican at last acknowledged the change. In 1966, the index was formally abolished, not with fire, but with a page turned. The Inquisition itself was renamed. The Holy Office became the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Its powers were reduced, its role redefined. No more trials, no more tortures, no more public shaming. But it remains. Today, it issues statements on doctrine. It advises on theological controversies. It defends orthodoxy in writing, not in flame. It is a relic, but it is not gone. And its memory lingers in museums filled with sanbenitos, in ruined prisons, in papal archives, in the shadow of church towers that once rang to summon the condemned. The Inquisition, once a storm, is now a ghost. But like all ghosts, it haunts not only where it lived, but where it was feared. Chapter 11. Fire Remembered. What do we do with the memory of fire? The Inquisition, though ended, casts a long shadow, not because its flames still burn, but because they burned for so long. For nearly 7 centuries, people lived with the knowledge that belief could be a crime, that questions could be deadly, and that silence was sometimes the only prayer. We inherit more than history. We inherit fear. And fear, once written into law and ritual, does not die easily. The Inquisition was not just a relic of its time. It was a system, a choice, a structure built to preserve control, brick by brick, sermon by sermon, law by law. It was sustained not by monsters, but by people, rulers who confused unity with obedience, priests who believed pain could purify, and neighbors who whispered names in the dark. That is the most unsettling truth. This was not chaos, it was order, not madness, but method, and its legacy still echoes. We see it in every society that fears difference, in every system that punishes doubt, in every voice told to be quiet for the sake of peace. The Inquisition reminds us how easily violence can wear the mask of virtue, how conviction, unchecked, becomes conquest. But memory is resistance. To remember the Inquisition is not to dwell on cruelty, but to understand how it was built so we do not build it again. To study the silence it demanded so we may speak more clearly now. The Inquisitors asked, "Do you confess?" Our question must be different. What kind of world do we protect when we stop asking questions at all? The flames are gone, the record sealed, but the lesson still smolders. And if you found something in this story that stirred thought or reflection, we invite you, as always, to leave a comment, tap the bell, and join us again. This has been Bedtime Lectures, where the past speaks softly and we listen together in the dark.